So I thought I'd make a video about why actually crypto has value. I mean, you're watching here the Bitcoin strategy channel, so you're probably already kind of convinced, but I get this question from quote-unquote non-believers all the time, right? Bitcoin doesn't have any intrinsic value. You can't really do anything with it. It's all just a bubble and it will go to zero. There's nothing behind it. So why are there people out there that are willing to pay thousands of dollars of quote-unquote real money to buy this internet fake ghost money? So in this video I'm gonna dissect the different reasons why people actually buy Bitcoin. Because in the end, what is being bought, whatever has demand, has a price and thus has value. And so when we think about what drives the value, what drives the demand, then we can also imply from that if that demand will grow over time and if the price is expected to grow over time. Because in the end, the only question mark, especially for Bitcoin, is the demand. It's not the supply. In mainly any other asset, we don't really know the supply, right? The supply can change all the time. And so we have to figure out what's the demand change, what's the supply change to then come up with a price prediction. But in Bitcoin, that's a bit easier. We just have to look at demand. We just have to look at the potential price drivers. Now, the main driver right now is probably still just pure speculation. For altcoins, you can see this very clearly. There's a lot of transactions happening for altcoins. The velocity of transactions is pretty high. And so people just go in and out of the asset in order to actually make fiat gains. And you can still see this in Bitcoin quite a lot. If you think about why are you in Bitcoin, why are you watching channels like this, it's probably because you're interested in the price a lot. You buy Bitcoin because you want to buy it cheap and potentially sell it for a higher price. You're not buying Bitcoin because you want to do any other kinds of purchases that you can't do already with fiat, or because it's more convenient to pay with Bitcoin than with fiat. Usually it's rather the opposite. So the first and foremost reason to buy Bitcoin is speculation, and that's both on the retail side as well as on the institutional side. You're buying it now in order to sell it for a higher price in the future. And there's not necessarily something wrong with this, right? There's a lot of assets that work exactly that way. Not just gold, but even all these other alternative assets. If you buy a very expensive painting, or if you buy wine just to keep it and maybe sell it for a higher price later, that's all that same story, right? You bet on something being rare and on something becoming more valuable in the future, and so simply the expectation of future demand grows the price today. Now, why do we have this expectation of growing demand in the future? One reason obviously is that if we compare the properties of, say, Bitcoin to similar assets, so say gold or silver, we can see that its market cap is still comparatively low. And so we just think, okay, when something serves the similar purpose, when something has similar properties, or when something might even be superior in some ways, right, it's easier to transfer Bitcoin across borders than gold, for example, and it's also more scarce than gold. So when those properties are equal or superior, then we might expect the market cap also to be equal or even higher. And that would then bring Bitcoin to, say, at least 500,000 US dollars, so if you equal the market cap of gold with Bitcoin. Now that means that currently the main driver is the idea of adoption. More people coming into the space, more people going to adopt Bitcoin. And that's a very interesting price driver because it's very different to price drivers of other assets. If you look at, for example, what drives the gold price, with gold, we know that it's kind of a saturated market. Whoever wants gold already has gold. And there's not going to be like a big wave, a big hype wave of completely new people coming into the market because they don't really understand what gold is. So the adoption for gold has finished. So what currently drives gold prices are rather questions around money printing. How much does the money supply in general increase? How safe are stocks? So let's say the money supply goes up a lot, the economy does really bad, then in theory gold should do very well, even though recently during Corona it has not, probably because some of that money went into Bitcoin. But yeah, these are the kind of ideas of price drivers for gold. For stocks, it's the general health of the economy. For bonds, not that different. And so when you have an asset that appreciates independent of those global economic drivers, then you suddenly have returns that are not correlated to those global economic drivers. And that's very interesting for any kind of asset allocation. allocator. So suddenly you've got an asset that tends to appreciate over time because it's rare, so it becomes more rare compared to the fiat that's being printed. So pretty surely you've got an uptrend that stays viable for a long time. But at the same time, those price increases, they don't necessarily go in tandem with, say, the stock market. And when you now have two assets that are uncorrelated, you combine them into one portfolio, suddenly you've got price increases in which the volatility of those assets potentially cancel each other out. So when you just have both stocks and crypto, two lowly correlated asset classes, when you combine them together, you suddenly have value growth without as much price risk. And that's obviously super attractive, right? That's a high Sharpe ratio. You want that. Little volatility, high returns, and that makes Bitcoin so attractive, the low volatility to other asset classes. Now, what makes Bitcoin also very attractive, what's also a value driver in this regard, is its currently still very high volatility. So when you look at the average price movements of, say, the S&P 500 on a day, you get to something below 1%. So on average, the price of the S&P 500, it moves up and down less than 1% per day. And the same holds true for gold. For Bitcoin, that's very different. For Bitcoin, that's around 3% per day. So the volatility is much higher. And why is this interesting for some investors, for some institutional investors? It's because hedge funds, for example, they get compensated on an annual static fee, but also based on a performance fee. And even if you say you can't really predict the Bitcoin price, so let's say you're completely agnostic and you say, okay, I don't know how efficient that market is. For me, this is all completely random. But what I do know is that Bitcoin is more volatile than other assets. Then you, as a hedge fund manager, have an advantage, because let's say your return distribution now is wider. So say your simulation for stocks, it would give you like a return distribution that's pretty narrow. And when you're lucky, quote unquote, because you say you can't really time the market, you would get a bit of return in case it plays out well. But if you now have a much more volatile asset and you get compensated based on the upside, so say you get 20% compensated for the upside, if you now have a wider distribution, you potentially have a much higher compensation. Or another way to think about this is basically, if you have a hedge fund, a great chunk of your compensation is basically like a call option on your fund. And we know with call options, the higher the volatility, the higher the value. So you as a hedge fund want to invest into very highly speculative, volatile assets. And so thus I think it's very likely that we will see more adoptions, not just right now as we've seen from a few S&P 500 companies or from asset allocators, from family offices that use this as a diversifier, but actually from hedge funds. There are specific crypto hedge funds, but I can imagine that even what I now consider traditional hedge funds, they might be interested in getting into crypto more simply because of the high volatility. And they can take the risk because it's other people's money, right? They get paid off if it goes well, and they personally at least don't lose anything besides, say, reputation, but meh, what's reputation, right? They get paid off way more when they take something like crypto in their funds. And right now this might not be possible because maybe they've got a mandate that they're only able to speculate in stocks, but there might be a push in the future that this will change simply because of the interests, right? They've got interest to trade. Now the reasons I've so far listed are still just investment related, right? They're like future looking, there's anticipation for more demand, and so there's more demand now, and so there's this enforcing effect. But what are the more fundamental reasons, right? One fundamental reason is obviously the same use case as gold. So it's an inflation hedge, it's a fiat hedge, a hedge against debasement of the currency. And you can see that obviously there has been quite a bit of debasement. The S&P 500 is at all-time highs, while the economy is obviously not outputting at all-time highs. The same goes for property. Lots of properties at sky-high prices, even though there's vacancy. So there is some devaluation going on, maybe not directly yet in most consumer prices, but it seems to be quite obvious right now, pretty hard to argue against a devaluing of all of global fiat right now. So we've got the fiat hedge. But one hedge that is pretty unique to Bitcoin, which I think is probably currently one of the main long-term drivers, is its inability to be confiscated. So for the very first time in history, we suddenly have an asset that we can take cross-border without any government being able to stop that. We can take it cross-border, we can take it across time, and it can't be taken away. And that's incredibly valuable because it's the ultimate protection against a hostile government. If the government becomes too hostile in terms of, for example, taxing the wealth or in case it makes any laws that are inherently against the people. There was no way to protect yourself against this. There was no way to store some wealth completely off the system. If your bank goes bust, and all other banks as well, and the government has to bail them all out, and all of this bailing out kills the value of fiat, you had no way to protect yourself. You could have bought some gold, but then let's say you want to put it across the border, this might become illegal, right? Very likely actually in this scenario. And so try to get on an airplane with a few bars of gold. You're probably going to be stopped. So you have to be very fancy, you have to be very sophisticated about how to get your gold out of a country where you're not allowed to take gold out. So I think this is incredibly valuable. Just look at all the people that are not currently in a situation where the government is very stable, where you can't really anticipate what's going to happen. If you live in such an environment and you don't really know what's going to happen, then maybe you don't want to store all your wealth in crypto, but having a bit of money off the grid in case things turn really sour, it might be the wise thing to do. And the time to do this is probably rather now than in a few years when this happens, because then it might already be too late. And so the question is, do you think that governments will act rationally around the globe going forward? Or do you think maybe that the trend is not as calming right now? I personally think governments tend to become more extremist. There's very extreme views in any country right now. Nationalism is growing again in Germany, in France. Isolating policy is happening. There used to be times when China and the US were better friends than today. And so when there's no real way to do physical warfare anymore because it's simply too dangerous, you can't bomb each other, there's still the option of economic warfare. And you don't want to be squeezed in the middle of such an economic warfare where you can't really predict what kinds of things go up and down, and it's all just dependent on what the politicians think. Bitcoin is basically the vehicle that you can always fall back to, and the more it gets adopted in regular use, the better of a fallback mechanism it will become, right? Look at how WikiLeaks takes donations. They can't take donations with Visa, right? Look at some other websites that are not as friendly, where just Visa or PayPal says, sorry, it's out of our policies. Those central payment processors, they basically have the power to do politics. They can say, oh, it's our right as a company simply not to serve you. We don't like this kind of business model. We don't like what you're doing. And so you have nothing to do against this. But with Bitcoin, there's no such limitation. And so when you have no other choice right now, you might already take that route, even though adoption is so low, right? It's pretty hard to give a donation with WikiLeaks when you're not using Bitcoin on a daily basis, which most people don't. And so you've got a very intrinsic value here, right? You're cutting out potential regulation that might be hostile. And so even though you don't have to use it, simply the sole existence of this is hopefully already enough to deter some governments to make too hostile policies, right? Having atomic bombs already keeps governments in check not to declare war on each other. Having Bitcoin might keep governments in check not to do something completely outlandish against the wealthy people that might have built the country, that might have contributed with adding utility to society. Last but not least, what I think is going to be a pretty strong price driver is the adoption for international payments, for payments between companies across borders. So once adoption is higher and it's more common to pay each other, at least for large amounts, in Bitcoin, and once volatility slows down, which probably still takes quite a while, it's still very volatile, it's still a play on future adoption, but once volatility goes down and it's really used as a transfer mechanism of wealth, and it's not anymore something exotic to hold Bitcoin on your balance sheet, it's something rather normal, then suddenly you can make transfers across borders without having to wait for a long time, without having all these costs that incur from converting the currency. And so it will be much more straightforward to pay somebody in China for your goods than it is today. Bitcoin might not be practical right now because of the volatility and because of the costs associated with it, but because it's scarce and thus will increase over time and thus will become something a lot of people will hold for the long term. That's the reason why I think it will also become more normal to use as a payment mechanism. And the costs will come down, the volatility will come down, and so all the negatives you currently have with Bitcoin, they basically will disappear. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to give this a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, click subscribe as well. I publish videos 2 to 3 times every week. And last but not least, we've got a Telegram channel. The link is in the video description below. It's called Bitcoin Strategy Channel. Feel free to join there as well. We are around 100 people. It's completely spam free. See you next time. Bye bye.